We're seeing a rise of radicalism on the left, both on the far left, communist Marxist side, but there's also a rise of, black anti-Semitism, Muslim anti-Semitism, and all of these different groups of people that the Democrats are really trying to suck up to.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about whether the left has learned anything at all from its electoral losses this year, especially on the issue of anti-Semitism. I'm Kaylee McGee-White, and this is Restoring America. Democrats lost ground among just about every demographic this electoral cycle, with white men, black men, Hispanics, suburban women, and with Jewish voters. It's estimated President-elect Donald Trump picked up more than 50% of the Jewish vote in New York alone. That's significant because this is a group that has for years voted in lockstep with the Democratic Party. But Democrats took this voting bloc for granted, as anti-Israel protests swept college campuses across the country, and as sitting Democratic members of Congress openly called for the U.S. to abandon its ally Israel in its fight against Hamas, Democratic leadership apparently thought these events wouldn't matter all that much to Jewish Americans. Well, they did. But will Democrats change course? After all, the vocally anti-Israel squad is still very loud and unfortunately influential, especially in the House. And too many other Democrats seem reluctant to weigh in on the Israeli conflict at all. So scared are they of angering the leftist activists who seem to be running the show these days. One example that comes to mind is Vice President Kamala Harris, who tried very hard to thread the needle of pleasing both Jewish voters and anti-Israel voters. There are many lessons to be learned from Harris's failures, if Democrats are willing to confront them. Unfortunately, it's looking increasingly unlikely that they will. My guest today is going to explain more on this, but before we get to him, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and for more, head to WashingtonExaminer.com. Joining me today is Ian Haworth, a Washington Examiner contributor. Ian, thanks so much for joining. You have written a lot about anti-Semitism, especially the rise of anti-Semitism on the left. And for whatever reason, the Democratic Party seems very reluctant to confront this problem on their own side. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think a lot of it is really due to the power of identity politics reaching a climax right now. And we're seeing that Jews are both white, but not white. And so I think it's really backed Democrats into a corner for the longest time. They were quite happy to ride the bus of power with a lot of these minority groups, and Jews were included in this minority group category. But now that's really not the case. We're seeing a rise of radicalism on the left, both on the far left, communist Marxist side, but there's also a rise of, black anti-Semitism, Muslim anti-Semitism, and all of these different groups of people that the Democrats are really trying to suck up to. We saw that during the election campaign with Kamala Harris trying to thread the impossibly thin needle of trying to appeal to Jewish voters and putting out pro-Israel messaging, and then trying to appeal to Muslim voters by putting out anti-Israel messaging. They're trying to balance all of these different minority groups, and ultimately you have to pick a side when it comes down to values. And so I think that's why we've seen it bubbling since 2018 in the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting and the rise of people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, things like that. But I think this election really showed that the Democrats have been forced into a corner by their own rhetoric, their own obsession with intersectionality. And they've been backed into a corner where they cannot, as the phrase goes, ride two horses with one ass. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
And one of the things that we also saw this election was an increasing number of Jewish voters defect from the Democratic Party over this issue and vote for Donald Trump in pretty overwhelming numbers comparatively. Do you think that shift among the Jewish demographic is permanent?
I'd like to think so, but unfortunately, I don't believe it will be. I think it'll certainly engage religious Jews, because for me, I think the split is usually between religious and secular Jews. So on the religious side, they tend to be politically conservative, but I think the rise in anti-Semitism have driven a lot of those people to the polls in support of the Republicans, who they would be likely to vote for anyway. I think the issue for me comes down to the secular Jews who have voted Democrat for decades, and I think now have been put off by the rhetoric of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the aftermath of October 7th. Now, unfortunately, sort of public perception and public memory is quite short. eventually the memory of October 7th will start to fade away if it hasn't already. I mean, just think about September 11th, and we have a whole new generation who weren't around during September 11th. It's a very abstract thing. For a lot of people, they're rewriting the history of that. I think the same will be true of October 7th to a greater extent because people view it as a quote unquote foreign war, which of course it's not. But I think we're going to see a lot of people return to the same old voting patterns of once you have a Democrat who comes in who isn't quite as insane on this level as Kamala Harris, for example, someone who speaks out against Hamas quite clearly, perhaps doesn't fund Hamas with delivery of food and a pier that sinks after 3 weeks and wastes hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. If we have basic sanity on the Democratic Party, I think this issue will be far less stark. And that will mean a lot of sort of secular Jews whose religion isn't the driving factor behind their voting are going to just move back to the Democratic Party. And as part of that answer, I think that's a message to Republicans to make sure that we keep this momentum up. Once you have people voting for you, you have to keep their vote. And I think a big part of that is to continue this messaging, to continue the fight against anti-Semitism across the board and make it not just focused on Israel, but focused on domestic anti-Semitism, because that's a huge battle that's going to affect a lot of Americans for years, if not decades to come. And so I think we got momentum from October 7th. That sounds horrible to say, but that's the reality of politics. And so now it's up to the Republican Party to keep earning these votes because hopefully the next Democrat down the pipeline will not be as insane as Joe Biden on this issue and not as ridiculously incompetent on this issue as Kamala Harris. And we have to be prepared for that.
And speaking of this, what are some concrete policy actions that Donald Trump and the new Republican coalition can take to keep some of these Jewish voters at home in the GOP? You've mentioned the domestic front. Obviously, I think a big piece of this is higher education specifically. So do you foresee any concrete actions the incoming Trump administration can take to really shore up the Jewish support for the GOP?
Yeah, I think it has to be a repeat of what he did during his first administration. Like, I'm one of the conservatives out there. I cheer him when he does good things. I criticize him when he does bad things. I think on the foreign policy front, though, he knocked it out of the park, especially with Israel and the Abraham Accords. I think a lot of it has to be at the center of this policy. If he achieved one thing in terms of anti-Semitism and Israel and any kind of bigotry against Jews, is really taking Iran out of the equation. If you can make sure that they do not have access to all of the funds that the Biden administration and the Obama administration before him gave them, then all of this goes away. Hamas goes away. Hezbollah goes away. A lot of the funding we're seeing trickling into higher education in America goes away. A lot of the things we're seeing on college campuses is bought and paid for. It's not organic. It's not exploding out of nowhere. We are having organizations across the country that are funding this with deep ties to organizations in Iran and therefore organizations with deep terror links. And so if we can take Iran out of the equation, I'm not calling for war, I'm sort of rhetorically take them out of the equation in terms of funding, in terms of support, the real driving factor behind all of this hatred goes away. Now, I'm not naive in thinking that's going to solve anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is always going to be there, as all forms of hate, unfortunately, are going to be there. But the money that comes from Iran causes everything. If Iran weren't empowered and created as a regional superpower due to Biden, Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, all of these people, October 7th would never have happened. And we wouldn't have seen the explosion of anti-Semitism that followed. So if you take Iran out of the equation, that is one concrete thing that I think Trump can do on day one in many ways. And that will solve a lot of these problems. Not fully, but I think we'll live in a completely different world and certainly a different Middle East.
Absolutely. Well, it's a very important conversation, so thanks so much for joining for it. And for more breaking news, exclusive interviews, and conservative views, be sure to check out WashingtonExaminer.com.